Well, the organizers have kindly agreed to allow me to say a few remarks at the beginning about the Ronald Coase Institute. I'm Mary Shirley. I'm the president of the Ronald Coase Institute. And I'm going to very briefly give you some sense of our background and what we do before I turn the floor over to our nameless next speaker. The roots of the Ronald Coase Institute really go back to 1996, to a conference on property rights that was organized in St. Louis by Lee Benham and Alexandra Benham at Washington University in St. Louis. And I, at that time, was still working for the World Bank Research Department, doing research on water with Roger Knoll and others. And I presented my paper at this conference to a small group of people who really were thinking very much the same way, including Ronald Coase, Douglas North, John Nye, and others. And after the meeting ended, a group of us, Lee Benham, Alexandra Benham, Claude Menard, and I, decided to start an academic society, which we call the International Society for New Institutional Economics, ISNE. And we had the brilliant idea of asking Ronald to be our first president, which he agreed to do. He came to the first meeting and he told the group at ISNE what their mission was, which he said, and I quote, to transform economics. And if you know Ronald, that's pretty characteristic. And indeed, ISNE was a big success, I think. It attracted a large following, very loyal from all over the world. But in 2000, I had a conversation with Ronald Coase, and he told me that he wasn't satisfied. He felt that we weren't doing enough for young scholars, that forming an academic society was really not enough to help young scholars, particularly young scholars in poorer countries. And he talked to me about the Castle Traveling Scholarship that he got famously back from the University of London, and that allowed him to travel in the United States during the Great Depression in 1931 and 1932. And as he said, I believe briefly on his video, that was when he met with a lot of businessmen and had an opportunity to talk about their problems and formulate the ideas that led later, of course, to the nature of the firm. And how grateful he was for that opportunity and how little support it really did take to help young people get started. He also talked about his faith in younger people to be able to see things clearly. He said on his video that the nature of the firm was an undergraduate essay, and he really pushed for the idea of giving more support to younger scholars. So based on that inspiration and with Ronald's help, Lee Benham and Alexandra Benham and I started the Ronald Coase Institute in 2000 with Ronald as our research director. We've been very fortunate to have an outstanding board of directors, including Douglas North, Kenneth Arrow, most recently Eleanor Ostrom, and also Gary Livecraft, Lee Benham, Claude Menard, and to have Alexandra Benham as the secretary of the board. We've also benefited from a lot of established scholars, many of them in this room, who have volunteered their time as faculty to our workshops. Our focus has been inspired by some of the statements of Ronald, and in particular when he said, "It makes little sense for economists to discuss the process of exchange without specifying the institutional setting within which the trading takes place, since this affects the incentives to produce and the cost of transacting." We believe in the Institute that local scholars often have a comparative advantage in studying the institutional framework in their own countries, particularly to understand norms of behavior in informal institutions. And they also are frequently more influential than outsiders over local opinion. They are frequently young professors, so they may be training the next generation of policymakers. And often they are the ones who may end up as advisors to the president or the president of central banks. But often these young scholars lack not only funding, but training, support, mentors, collaborators. They frequently will feel very isolated. And if any of you have ever been to countries and seen how things operate in universities in developing countries or in research institutes, you know as well as I that all too often all the rewards go to the head of the institute or the heads the important people in the university, and the younger scholars are isolated and they are starved for funds and for support, and even for feedback frequently. And on top of that, in many countries, of course, there's a lot of danger associated or risk associated with taking positions that are against established orthodoxy or established elites. So our goal in the Coase Institute is to try to break through that impasse, to help those young scholars feel part of a supportive network, and to give them the mentoring and feedback that they lack. One way we do this is through workshops. We hold 5-day workshops, and a group of us, in fact, are leaving this conference to go to our next workshop, which will be our 15th workshop in Xiamen, China. And today we've trained over 300 young scholars from 55 different countries. Besides these workshops, we also hold research conferences. We've had 3 here at the University of Chicago, and Ronald has attended all of them and spoken to the young people. We also have a network, a website that provides a lot of information on institutional economics and also a bibliography and background on Ronald Coase. We maintain, as I mentioned, a supportive network that we involve our scholars in, and where they can find like-minded people to talk to. And in addition to that, we do sometimes give small grants, but that's not our main focus. So I think there was a lot of conversation in the morning sessions about the impact and influence of Ronald Coase's ideas. And I just wanted to fill you in on what we're doing, which is another way in which Ronald has extended his influence to hundreds of scholars, often who are struggling in the field in their own countries. And we expect that too will go on to have an enormous impact in the future. So now let me introduce the man who needs no introduction, who will say a few opening remarks. I'm sure all of you know Douglas North. He's had a huge influence on me and many people in this room. Of course, he's teaching still at Washington University in St. Louis, and is a Nobel laureate as well. Richard told me not to give people's CVs or backgrounds, and certainly in the case of Ronald, in the case of Douglas, that would be redundant. So please, Douglas.
I'm not sure what I'm doing here. When Mary asked me to give a talk, I said, well, you know all the things that I'm going to say. And she said, well, you'll be at least a humorous appeal, but all the humor went out this morning, so I can't possibly compete with that this afternoon. But I thought I would talk to you for a minute about what I know about the operation of the Coase Institute, since I've been involved in a number of them and given talks at a number of them in various parts of the world. Because I think that Mary described it in broad detail, but I want to say some specific things. When you go to the Coase Institute, first of all, the people who have participated in them have been first rate. They've been good scholars who have taken sound advice and particularly drawn from the countries of their origin and applied the material from institutional analysis to problems not only in their own country but in other countries as well. The result has been that we have a group of young people now that, as Mary says, more than 300 who have participated in it, who are now beginning to influence the structure of organization and institutional analysis in their own country. The result is, I think, a very impressive tribute not only to Mary, who has been the founding thing, but also to Lee and Alexander Benham down there, who played a major role in it all the way along. But it's played a big role, and I can testify that in countries where I've been, whether it's in China or in other parts of the world, the Coase Institute has played a major role in shaping the thinking of young people, and gradually, since these young people are moving up the ladder to become leaders in their own country, making a beginning for a major play in influencing what's going to go on in the next years all over the world. So I think the Coase Institute is an immense achievement that Mary has played such a big role in, and I think it's just great. And I'm looking forward to hearing not only from my young colleague Sebastian, who's going to talk about some of the things I do, but some of the other young people who have participated in the Coase Institute. Thank you.
Okay, I think that I don't think there's any question about it so far. What we're going to do next is have 3 papers from 3 of the fellows of the Coase Institute, and I think because there's 3 of them, we may hold questions till the end and ask everyone to remember your questions for the end, and we'll have them all come up here and give give answers to your questions. So let's start now. The first person on the program is Sebastian Galiani. He's going to talk about land property rights and resource allocation. He's currently at Washington University in St. Louis, and he's attended our workshops not only as a scholar, but also as a faculty member, and been very generous in that regard. Sebastian, please.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to the organizers and also to Mary for the introduction. So I basically the objective of this paper that I'm writing with my co-author in this area, Ernesto Shagrowski from Universidad de Itela in Argentina, is to try to summarize some of the research that has been done recently in one specific area where property rights are really ill-defined, generally through the developing world are quite feeble and weak, which is land. And land seems, as I can argue, it's very important because it constitutes most of the wealth of the people, of the poor people in developing countries. So there's been a lot of attention on the importance of this issue. So this is obviously related to a very important question that has been part of focus in the first session, which is what's the impact of well-defined land property rights on economic development. And so now there's quite agreement that the fragility of property rights is a crucial obstacle for economic development. But in a sense, and in particular regarding to land, there is the question of how large is this effect, and that's mainly what this literature is trying to address, and that's one thing. The second thing that really matters is through what channels it operates, because there might be some channels, I came to that in a second in my talk. And then how can we really assess that empirically, which is not easy because of a lot of possible ways in which property right allocation is endogenous. Okay, so I'm going to talk about that briefly. So basically, as I say, land property rights are usually a large share of household wealth. So because of that, if property rights are not well defined, then people might misinvest or might misallocate resources, which will perpetuate poverty. So in development economics, there's been a lot of interest recently in this question. But what's the problem? The problem is that people that have been studying this, so starting long ago in Sub-Saharan Africa, where property rights are perhaps the place where they are more misspecified all over the world, have to face this endogeneity problem. So just to give you 2 examples of this is, so you go to rural areas and there's going to be, because of preconditions that I'm also going to talk in a second more about them, Because of preconditions, you will find that there's some land that is more valuable economically, and hence is more likely that people will pay the cost of define better property rights for that land. And hence, if you then correlate property rights in any dimension in which you can measure them with outcomes, there's going to be simultaneity, right? It is the land that has the highest value, the one that the property rights are better defined. But then you might say, well, let's exploit not that type of difference in land rights, but the type of difference that came from interventions, where governments go and try to do something to change the definition of property rights, and some people get into that program as another term. Oh, but in general, that's also endogenous because that's related to wealth, political connections, where you are in the country, and so on and so forth. So it's a difficult program. So, of course, the first solution will be in one of those programs, sort of try to do an experiment, but no one done that, so I'm going to skip that. But it's possible, right? At least in development economics, there's a growing emphasis on experimentation. So it might be that soon we get this kind of evidence. But not having that, the first thing we want to do is to mimic that, and that now we call natural experiments, and I'm going to talk a bit about some of them. But I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to emphasize one case, but in the papers we go over the ones that are available. What will happen in a natural experiment? Will happen something similar to an experiment, but the experiment, the researcher is not the one that manipulates the treatment. It's something that naturally happens, but statistically have similar properties. Or more often, most papers have relied more on quasi-experiments to deal with this, which basically is the use of, or relying on fixed effects, exploiting either geographical variability within households, so households may own plots under different property rights, or over time exploiting the timing of programs that have been introduced. So basically what we try to do here is to take stock of this literature to see what we learn, what are the effects, and maybe through what channels they operate. So basically, how property rights affect efficiency of resource allocation? Well, by mainly two broad, we can open these two categories and go inside them. If I have time, I'll do it. But for now, let me say by limiting expropriation and by facilitating exchange, okay? And within facilitating exchange, there's been recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, one particular channel that got a lot of attention, which is the collateral, the fact that this idea that credit markets use collateral extensively for its operation, and once basically the poor may have land that is not their property rights not well defined, they cannot use as collateral, and that impedes access to credit and the creation of wealth in society. So I'm going to look at that into detail. But that's not the only channel through which property rights will facilitate the exchange, but it's the one that the literature focuses most. So in other channels, the thing is we might not even have evidence. The first thing to notice, and in the paper we illustrate this with a general model, which has partial, or we hope that we are going to get also to general equilibrium effects, is that there's going to be heterogeneous effects, right? So you will have the literature out there that the first thing papers will try to do is try to deal with endogeneity. And so they will go outside, find for this quasi, or look for this quasi-experiment, and they will try to exploit that, maximizing what people call in statistics internal validity. Of course, that will somehow impede external validity, and that's one trade-off. But there's something that then you have to take into account when you look at the results, okay? So there's going to be a heterogeneous effect across studies because, let's say, the status quo of property right in each study is going to be different. So, for example, if you go to Ghana, there's going to be certain rights that might follow the matrilineal system, or if you go to Madagascar, even still in sub-Saharan Africa, the property rights will be less determined by political connections, and hence the status quo is different. And so when you change property rights, even if you do it in similar ways in Ghana and Madagascar, the effects that you might expect are different. So also the institutional context of the country or the region will matter a lot, because in places where still, I mean, in a sense, all this is about reducing transaction costs, and if dealing with the state and state enforcement of property rights has transaction costs that are quite similar to whatever is in the status quo, well, that's not going to make a difference, okay? So, and this is very general to property rights studies, I will say in general, but once you get to land, rural versus urban use of land makes a whole difference, because in rural areas people will use the land as an input of production, and hence if altering the property rights affects the way they use the land, that will affect their earnings directly, while in urban areas that's not going to happen. Well, it might happen, but not as directly as. So one possibility is, because it will happen if it facilitates the exchange, because it might go through the collateral effect, so if people get credit because of that, or it might happen if basically, but this I have to be careful, if basically there are some complementarities in the use of labor, in the sense between market and protecting assets. So if that happens, if families are constrained at that margin, it might be that then by reducing the risk of expropriation, people can liberalize labor that it was used for protection and send that to the market. It might happen. I'm not sure how relevant it is. So it also will depend on the wealth of the beneficiaries, because if people is very, very poor, even they're not going to be constrained in the credit market by not having collateral. So and that might be what's going on in all these studies, as you see when I get to summarize more results. And then the demand and supply of credit, again, will matter. And the mobility of population, okay? And whether multiple plots are used as well, because when financial markets are not available, people may use multiple plots for insurance, and then if you sort of go and improve on the property right from, but that came at the cost of privatizing land, and so people stop using multiple plots, well, they will lose the insurance aspect of that. Okay, so these preconditions will differ in many areas, but one that clearly is very obvious that we should focus first as an start is between rural and urban areas. Therefore, I'm going to look separately at rural and urban studies. So again, because I don't have a lot of time, I cannot go into detail into each paper, but let me say that there's some papers, more actually in rural areas than in urban, that has trying to address, at least from a statistical point of view, in each area, endogeneity, and have came with results, okay? The first one is Besley, well, it's not 55, sorry, it's 95, in the Journal of Political Economy, and basically he, in Ghana, and this is interesting to illustrate the problem of endogeneity. He has two areas in Ghana, one is Wasa and the other is Angola. In Ghana, he finds that more secure property rights led to more investment, but in Angola, he finds no effect. But he was reanalyzing data collected by the World Bank, and the World Bank paper that did not address endogeneity found exactly the opposite results, right? But they found that in Ghana there was no effect, and in Angola there was big effect. So that illustrates how severe is the problem of indigeneity. More recently, again, in the Journal of Political Economy, Udry and Goldstein exploit also in Ghana political connections, because as I say, in this matrilineal system of assigning property rights, having political connection will ensure you that you will keep having access to the same plots you are exploiting, so that's going to affect following. So if you have a longer time horizon, you're more likely to invest in follow, and that will increase productivity and reduce output. And they find large effects. To my knowledge, this is the study that finds the largest effect ever in terms of the effects of ill-defined property rights on land, on productivity and investment. Well, that's kind of papers in Africa. There's a paper in the American Economic Review by Jacobi in 2002 where they look at the risk of expropriation and again investment and productivity in land, and they find also effects. And this, I will say, just for the sake of brevity, is confirmed in studies by Bandiera, Alston et al., Gary Liebeckap, and Dan Lueck. He talked a bit as an introduction of this morning about this paper, Rosselli and Swinen, for different areas, Latin America, Eastern Europe. Yeah, that's. Okay, so one thing is that you can take from this paper is, yeah, better defined property rights in urban areas, it always affects investment. Well, better defined property rights in one sense stimulate investment, which is as we expected. But then none of these exploit any policy variation. It's not something that we can change political. So if you go to, let's say, the Ghana study, which finds the larger effect, it's not that we can say, well, people have to have, how do we going to get these more secure property rights, not through basically stimulating their political connections. Anyway, you cannot do for everyone. So basically, you want to introduce a reform there, like, for example, land titles or registration, that you will hope will provide these more secure property rights and get the same results. The problem is that there's few studies looking at that, and the one that explicitly look at the land titling program in Madagascar find very little effects on investment, some effects on land price values, and once you basically take into account and do the sort of the cost-benefit analysis, because of course enacting and legalizing titles has a cost, they find that only large plots are worth titling, and those not the typical situation, at least in sub-Saharan Africa. So you will conclude maybe that the status quo, once you take into account the transaction cost of enacting the institution of titling, is not that inefficient. But I don't think we can generalize from one study that, given the large effect, given the fact that the other papers exploiting different variations in secure property rights have found much larger effects. So one thing that we want to do is to try to generalize this cost-benefit analysis for more studies in this paper, sort of do a kind of meta-analysis of that. But then again, there's another study where they look at rural land, a huge program of titling in rural areas in Vietnam, which is much more promising in terms of the cost-benefit analysis. Okay. So once we move to land titling in urban areas, here the situation is quite different. So it's clear that land is very scarce in urban areas. It's valuable. So the reason for not having well-defined property rights is not that it's not valuable, as it might happen in some rural areas. But as I said before, there's not going to be productivity effects or earnings effects that go directly by just improving secure property rights. So if it happens through indirect channels. So we explicitly have to focus on access to credit and labor market here, outcomes. So I'm first going to talk about a bunch of papers by myself and co-authors, and then by Erika Phil, who exploits a large titling program in Peru that actually was the program that De Soto promoted when he was related to the government. So this is exploiting a natural experiment in Buenos Aires. So how much time do I have? 5 minutes, good. So exploiting this, basically, we look at the effects of land title on investment, household structure, human capital, credit, earnings, and belief of squatters. I'm not going to talk about belief today because of lack of time. It's very interesting. But let me talk about the similar outcomes I was considering before. So how this natural, in 1 minute, basically there's a group of squatters in the early 80s. They moved to a piece of land, typical of urban areas in developing countries, mainly because the credit markets don't work for the poor, right? And so basically, through the process of development, they move from rural areas to urban areas because there's better labor market prospects there. But they squat land and they informally settle because they cannot buy houses or using credit. Once they moved there, it turns out that the land didn't belong to the state as they do. It belongs to certain different owners. And so the government passed a law to expropriate the owners, and then if the owners surrender the land, they were going to transfer the titles to the squatters. Then the squatters have to pay over 10 years back to the government the fiscal cost of that. But what happened is that some owners surrendered the land and some owners didn't surrender the land. And so then we have this situation where some people receive land titles and others didn't, in a very small piece of land that is really homogeneous. And one thing that we show in the paper is that those who received land and those who didn't, there's no observable difference in land or observable difference in the characteristics of the original squatter. Okay. So looking at that in this series of papers, we first look at the obvious. Well, I would say, because following the logic of reasoning that I've been developing so far, the obvious will be access to credit and earnings. And we find very small effects on credit, formal credit I'm talking, and no effects on earnings after 13 to 17 years. So basically, let me say that we did a study collecting data in 2003, and the first two papers I mentioned were done using this data. And so once you don't find effects on credit and earnings, you might say, well, then there's going to be no effect on welfare, well, other than maybe physical investment in the house. It might be that they invest more in the house because, and this is because basically more secure property rights facilitate the exchange. So one thing that we know from this market is that if you don't have a title and you invest in the land, then if you want to sell, you have to sell at a high discount. So by affecting how the markets work, it still stimulates investment. And what we find is that these squatters invested 40% more in the house, sort of 13 years after we visit them. But even after 4 or 5 years, because I don't have time to enter into detail, but we have an early treatment group and a late treatment group because of what happened through time here. But then what we find is that there were some effects in household structure that were not part of this discussion that might be important in other areas. Once you give property rights to someone in the house, he might exercise to decide who is allowed to live in the house and who doesn't. So the houses that were not titled are places where you find a lot of other people residing there. Yeah, 2 minutes. Okay, so, and then this was a small adjustment in fertility, well, some adjustment in fertility. So then, funded by the Ronald Coase Institute, and I thank again once more for that, we revisit this household because in the 2003, the children of these houses were all at the age of finishing at most primary school. And so even the poor go to primary school in Latin American urban areas. So we find some difference in the quality, in the human capital accumulation of the children, but they were very small. They were like 0.4 years of education. Maybe it's not small, but it wasn't something that you can say, well, that's a splash. So in the follow-up survey, we were able to test the difference for the probability of finishing in secondary school, and there we find much larger effects of the order of 25 points higher, which means basically that this household moved from the typical poor household completion rates to the middle class completion rate in the country. And we also find some effects on health, which are not surprising because they are quite related to housing, though there's not many studies in housing. So this just is the typical difference between a house that got the titles and one that didn't, that appeared in the Wall Street Journal that ran an article following our paper. And then just to finish, then Erika Phil also did a very nice study in Lima, where exploiting panel data on that program intervention, she finds also similar and large effects on investment of the order of 60%. But then she finds also labor supply effects, which we don't. However, she doesn't find much effect on credit either. So there's more to say about labor supply, but I won't have much time. So my parting thoughts, just to finish, is that secure property rights in land seems to improve investment everywhere. There's less evidence about the collateral effect. I will say this at this point, there's very little on that. In rural areas, land titling might not always be cost effective, though in urban areas seems to be. And in urban areas, there might be important effects on household structure and capital accumulation.
Our next paper is going to be by Xiaofan Chen and Ximin Liao, and that's on why the entry regulation of China's mobile phone manufacturing industry collapsed, the impact of technological innovation or institutional transformation.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, the organizer of this conference. It's our honor to share this interesting story happening in China with you. Basically, we are trying to answer an interesting question. Why the Chinese government would stop their license regulation into the mobile phone manufacturing industry in China. This is the outline of our talk. First, we will describe the brief history of this license regulation. Second, we will talk about technological innovation happened in 2004, which has changed the whole situation. Then we will talk about the rise of bad phones, which was caused by this new technology. Finally, we will describe the impact of this new technology and the bad phones upon the industry and the regulation system. Here are some actors of our story. We have a central government who have invested the power to the regulator, and then the regulator issued some license to the mobile phone manufacturers. Most of them are the state-owned enterprises. And here is a history of this license system. About 11 years ago, in 1998, the Chinese government initiated a license regulation, and no enterprises was allowed to produce mobile phones unless they first get a license from the regulator. And in the following year, the regulator issued about 50 licenses, and most of them are the state-owned enterprises and failed to the regulator. And this system was very strict because we find that in the following 5 or 6 years, no more licenses were issued. And this has created a large monopoly rent for the license holders. And most of them didn't produce mobile phones by themselves. Instead, they just make profit by leasing the license to other enterprises. And this system was harshly criticized by the private enterprises, but in year 2004, the regulator said they will keep this, they will stick to this license system. However, only 1 year later, they relaxed this license regulation, and some more and more enterprises got the license. And soon, in 2 years later, in 2007, they formally abolished this system. So what happened during this period? We found most possible reason is new technology innovation happened in 2004. This is an integrated chip invented by a Taiwan company. This chip has integrated all the basic software of mobile phones into one chip, and it greatly reduced the production cost of mobile phones. And after this innovation, the market price of the phones fell about 80%. Producing mobile phone became much easier than before. And so soon after this technology was introduced into mainland China, thousands of mobile phone factories appeared in southern China, most of them located in Shenzhen city. And they produce numerous phones, which was called battered phones. Here are some pictures of these phones. You can see that their appearance was were very fancy, and more importantly, they were very cheap, much cheaper than the legal cell phones. And some of them even have fashion functions or appearance, just like the famous brands like iPhones. So it is imaginable that soon after that, these battered phones flooded the domestic market, and many poor people could afford such battered phones. We can see that even a beggar on the street can make a call, and the right picture is a man have to climb up the tree to make a call because in the remote area the signal was very weak. So it is very interesting that nearly in the same year, we found that there was a large scale of financial failure of nearly all the state-owned mobile phone producers. Here is one of the biggest enterprises at that time. We can see that from 2004, its profit began to fall, and in the next year, it suffered a large loss. And in 2007, just in the same year when the system was abolished, this corporation exited from the market. And the situation of another enterprise was very similar. And we can see the critical time is 2004. Besides the battered phones, we also considered other possible explanation for the failure of these state-owned enterprises. For example, could it be the market situation was going down during that time? Not likely. This is a number of the customers of mobile phones in the past 10 years. we can see that it was keep going up very rapidly. And we also considered the competition from abroad. Here is the number of mobile phones imported into China during the past 10 years. We found that in year 2004 and 2005, the number was reduced obviously, so it could not be the competition from abroad. So here is the logic of this story. The new technology sharply reduced the production cost of mobile phone, and thus caused numerous illegal producers flooding into this market. And it became much difficult for the regulator to enforce its regulation. So, so holding a license itself could not bring monopoly rents for this state-owned enterprises because the market was very, very competitive. So the license has no value, which may explain why the interest group didn't keep this system going on. But this is not the whole story, because we still have another two main actors in this story. The one is the local government, because nearly all the illegal enterprises was in the Shenzhen, South China, and the regulator is in Beijing. It didn't have enough enforcement force in the southern China, so it had to rely on the local government to enforce the regulation. However, the local government must have their own interest. The battery phone was developed very rapidly, and it increased the employment opportunities and tax revenues for the local government. And we also have another actor. It is the network operators. So the interesting question is why the network operators didn't simply reject these battery phones connecting to the network. So we think the most possible reason is that they also get benefited from the battery phones. Here is the data of the total profit of the network service providers in China. We can see that in the past 10 years, the profit was kept going up. And if after 2004, the profit was even increasing with a more rapid speed. Another question is why the central government didn't force the network operators to support the regulator. We have not found the definite answer, but a possible reason is that the network operators are directly subjected to the central government, not subject to the authority of the regulator, and its revenue were much bigger than the manufacturers. We have two network operators in China. The China Mobile is the largest one. Here is the example. In 2007, the China Mobile's profit was about 200 billion Chinese yuan, while the Bird company, who was the largest mobile phone manufacturers in China, its profit was only 6 million Chinese yuan. So we can see the profits of the China Mobile is much bigger than the Bird. And there was only about 50 manufacturers like Bird in China at that time. So we guess that the central government may have to balance the interest of these different groups. So here's our brief summary. We think there are maybe two possible reasons for the abolishment of this license regulation system. The first is that new technology has sharply reduced the production cost and increased the enforcement cost of the regulator. And another reason is there are conflicts of the interest between different government agencies in China. And these two factors may have caused the collapse of this whole system. Thank you.
I might add that this is a work in progress, and there are a lot of people in the audience who are expert in this field who might be interested in lending a hand to the two authors in pushing this work further. So our next speaker and our final speaker is Lennon Choi, who is at the Polytechnic University in Hong Kong. He's going to present his paper on housing as durable lemons and under different structures of property rights. Lennon.
And also Professor No for inviting me to attend this important event. And it only takes me about 15-hour flight from Hong Kong to here, and there's such thing as jet lag, so I woke up at 3 a.m. this morning, and now it's 5 a.m. in Hong Kong. Don't worry, I'm doing good, so I hope I can do my job. So this paper concerns about lemon. So you see Professor Coase is very puzzling about lemon, which in the US you are referring to product of inferior quality or product with defects, which is usually known, the problem is known by the seller, while it is very difficult for the buyer to discern. So given this information asymmetry problem, that the seller used to overprice the lemon. So this paper actually wants to address the questions that under the common law doctrine of the lest the buyer beware or the careful emptor. So it always paid the seller to conceal all the information and overprice the lemon. So this is, we refer the property right to information is assigned to the seller. So we want to ask, how about if we have another legal institution of which the let the seller beware principle prevailed? So would this overpricing behavior would be different? Would it be more expensive or less expensive for the lemon? So we're so lucky that we have a network experiment in Hong Kong's housing market, where we got a project that the housing developer is going to put up a massive development project in Hong Kong, where the government is actually planning to build a highway, actually stretching through the development, which was, by the time, not known to the general public. However, it is completely known by the housing developer, because when you just check the restrictive covenant of the government lease, you find every conditions on the government leases asking the developer to reserve area for the building of this highway project. So in Hong Kong, we have this sales of uncompleted units or pre-sales arrangement that the housing developer, they can sell off the unit before completion. So there's a problem that because of this peculiarity of the pre-sales market, that the buyer actually cannot inspect the property before they sign the contract. So the lest the buyer beware principle, unfortunately, would not be applied. So instead, the government has imposed certain rules of the let the seller beware principle in the pre-sales market. So we have this natural experiment that actually the housing developer were selling the lemons under this let the seller beware principle. While after completion of the project, some of these future lemons was resold in the secondary market, where the let the buyer beware principle was prevailed. So this is the floor plan for the subject development, where you see is a very typical residential development in Hong Kong. You see there's a lot of high-rise apartment building putting up on a what we call a massive shopping arcade. And the housing developer actually didn't tell the buyer back to this time that there's going to have a highway, public highway to be built. Actually, straggling through the whole development, so which is indicated in the red line, and this red line is superimposed by me, but not by the developer. So here is the durable lemon, you can see. So actually, this you can see a highway getting inside the massive shopping arcade, where the developer, when they build this development project, they actually has concealed the hole, the big hole. The buyer actually do not see the big hole. So they conceal the big hole as if there's no highway to be built in a few years' time. So what you can see is that those apartment units above the highway would be severely suffer from the traffic noise and problems, so on. So we have conducted a econometrics test based on a panel data set of 1,600 transactions. And what we are using is the technique by Serene Rollins, hedonic price model, and we control all the attributes. And what we find, this is the major findings. We find under both legal institutions, the lemon are overpriced. When the let the seller beware principle prevails, the lemon was overpriced for 7%. While in the secondary market, where the let the buyer beware principle prevails, they have 10% overpriced. So which is actually the price difference between lemon and non-lemons. So the result is that, simply speaking, lemon are less overpriced when the property right to information is assigned to the buyers. So we have two possible explanations. The first one, we think that the housing developer deliberately to do so because by giving this 3% of standable discount to the buyer, that will encourage the buyer to flip the lemon in the secondary market. That will discharge their liability according to the privity doctrine. Another possible reason is because of the rule of liabilities. We have constructed an economic model and showing that actually the pricing of the lemon would depend on the perceived chance of winning if there arise lawsuit. So if under the seller's beware principle, the seller will perceive a lower chance of winning the court case because the property right to information has been assigned to the buyer. So they tends to be less overpriced the lemon at the outset. And the opposite would be the case for the let the buyer beware principle. So this is our explanation. And that's all for this empirical test. And as usual, we have more questions than answers after conducting a study. So after we have conducted this study, we go further to inquire about what are the impacts of different legal institutions to market transactions. So there has been a lot of legal scholars and economists who have attempted these questions. And we also get that through these empirical findings, we are contributing to this literature. So in general, what we find and what we believe is that under the buyer let the seller beware principle, the general price of commodities will be higher because there's a compulsory tie-in insurance element, and the seller would tend to over-invest on the instruction or disclaimer and so forth, so on. And the search cost for the buyer would be lower because they tend to do less searching for the product because they would rest on the seller. And what we have found in our empirical test is that under the let the buyer beware principle, the lemon premium would be lower. While to compare, under the let the buyer beware principle, the general price level of commodity would be lower because the seller tends less to invest on this insurance element and also the disclaimer and instruction and so forth, so on. However, the search cost for the buyer will be higher because now they are themselves liable for any product of inferior quality or defects. And according to our empirical test, the lemon premium will be higher under this let the buyer beware principle. And you can think of other legal institutions like the strict liability, where the seller remains liable, even if the lemon is being flipped. So under this situation, perhaps you will find the lemon principal could be zero. However, the general commodity price would be very, very high in such a society. So this is a conference about Coase. So we want to draw some insights from Coase paper written in 1960. So he suggests in respective to whom the product rights is assigned to, efficient resources allocation will come about through this costless negotiations. So in theory, under these conditions, or under this theorem, the let the buyer or seller beware principle could be symmetrical. So if there's a freedom of contract, actually seller can give away warranty under the let the buyer beware principle, while the buyer can grant waiver under this let the seller beware principle. So in theory, these two liability rules can be symmetrical. However, has been correctly pointed out this morning by Professor Smith and tomorrow by Professor Damset. I read his paper. That actually Professor Coase is interested in the role of positive transaction costs. That would hinder that costless negotiation and freedom of contract and so forth and so on. So what is fascinating a young scholar in the Far East is are those new institutions emerge under this positive transaction cost regime in order to tackle with this lemon problem. So as you know, there's some established scheme in the U.S. like this warranty program or mandatory information disclosure program and so forth and so on has been successfully conducted. So we are fascinating to study about how this new institution will emerge in order to tackle with all these problems. 49 years ago, Professor Coase, when he wrote his paper on social costs, he drew a lot of examples and references in the real estate market. He said, economists list to study the broker, the restrictive covenants, large-scale real estate development company, governmental zoning and other regulatory activities. So 49 years later, we wish by doing this de facto empirical study in the real estate market would have some deserved contribution to the field of law economics and new institutional economics. So thank you.
That's how I got these great pictures of Ronald Lemon. Okay, we have time for some questions. You can ask anyone on the panel, including Doug or me. So please. Yes, please.
I understand your assertion that the seller would overinvest in quality or whatever, given that the seller is presumed to have the information cost advantage, and presumably, unless you're saying there's no competition in the seller's market, but if the housing market is competitive, I would assume that sellers would peel away the extra increment of quality based on the information they have.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. So this is actually what I refer to the new institutions. That reputation does solve a lot of problems. That the developer in Hong Kong, they are competitive, and they also strive to make better quality, and they pay a lot of attention for building up their brand name and products. So that also resolve a part of the problem, but not all. Yeah, given the setting.
But then that wouldn't be overinvestment. It's commercial investment.
I would say it would pay them to invest on those. But whether it is overinvestment, the empirical test, in fact, cannot answer this question. But that can be one of the concerns.
There's a question back here.
Sorry, I'm Roy Chen from the University of Chicago Law School. I have a question for the last speaker. Is it possible that your finding could also be interpreted by a situation where there is a huge demand in the real estate market, hugely demand for real estate, and therefore so in the primary market, you will see that the price difference between the quality housing and the real and the lemons won't be as much big as in a more mature market, for example, in this country. And so is that possible for your study? Because you concentrate on the study in Hong Kong, and during that period, my understanding that there is a huge flood of investment from the mainland China into Hong Kong to the real estate market. So could that affect the findings of your study? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do think to develop a better market like the one you have in this country, compared with those developing countries, it would take a long time to develop those what I call good or efficient institutions. So in the US, you have a lot of programs, not only in the real estate market, but also other products like second-hand car. So you have many new institutions developed in order to protect the consumer interests, and you have a discussion, debate about whether these strict liability rules or whether the product liability rules should be extended to certain type of commodities. So you have the refund scheme, which is I'm really fascinated when I came to the US. I find you can actually return any product to the train shop if you do not like it, which is not possible in Hong Kong or in China. So I think that these are a lot of new institutions, they emerge. It is because they want to tackle with part of the reason is that they would tackle with this lemons problem. So I would say in Hong Kong and in China, yes, you're right that we have a massive demand on real estate product. But it would take some time for us to develop those institutions that is so robust and can safeguard the interests of the consumer, like the one you have in the US.
Yes, please.
I have a question for Sebastian. So you currently focused on land codes of individuals, and you talked about urban environments. But with rural environments, in particular rainforests, I'm looking at, let's say, Guatemala, where when they've titled land to individuals, there's with these large tracts of land, there's enforcement issues where other people in the community are going through the rainforest and taking the lumber or taking the produce. And there's intergenerational issues where these people then, because they're all stealing from another's plots of land, they're racing to the bottom, they're not really concerned about the next generation. So they instead done titles for communities and having community-based land management. Do you see well-defined property rights for communities as a viable solution there? Or do you still see the long run being individual title land?
I think, again, property rights serve several purposes. So it might solve the problem of investment, but certainly it won't stimulate exchange. So that, I think, will be the take-up of what I say regarding your question.
I don't think that's my word.
I'm Daniel from the University of Science and Economics, and the senior fellow at the Information Economic project of Georgia Medicine Law School. Also, my research also covered China's telecommunication industry, chiefly on the telecommunication operation sector. Although I also done research on the telecommunication manufacturing sector. Basically, agree with the second paper's argument. The other say that technical innovation plus a conflicting interest argument lead to the collapse of mass regulation. But in terms of the second way of the conflicting interest argument, those data support the other's statement. The other cited the profit as an example to show the size of the sectors between the manufacturing and operation. Actually, the China Mobile is the biggest mobile operator, the biggest telecommunication operators in China. Its profit occupies almost 72% of total industry, total operations industry. But the board just one of 50 manufacturers in manufacturing sector. So this is the first one. The second, profit doesn't amount to the size of the industry. Actually, the manufacturing sector contributes to 7% of GDP of China, but the operation sector just contributes 1.8% of GDP. If the government just protect the biggest, occupier of the sector, the government should protect the manufacturing sector, not their operation sector. That which is against the state, the second point. The third, in terms of employment side and capitalization, actually the size of manufacturing is much bigger than operation sector. So I think why China Mobile has so the profit margin of the China Mobile is so big, but the profit of manufacturing sector is smaller. It's because that from the very beginning, the operation sector is less competitive. Actually, in the past, we just have two operators. Even among these two operators, China Mobile is actually dominating industry. Its number of subscribers is almost 6 times than its rival, China. So the profit margin is resulting from the basically very monopoly of this sector. So I agree. Actually, if you operate in this way, typical innovation plus conflicting of their government, I think you can find other leaders who will in the state of the second weight.
Thank you for your question and advice. One question is, yes, there are only two service operators in China, and the one I presented, China Mobile is the largest one, and the other one is China Unicom. It is smaller, but its size or its profit is about 1/3 of the China Mobile. Yeah, it's
No. Actually, China Mobile.
I think I think we should move on. Maybe you two can fight this out later. Yes, please.
So this is for Sebastian. I'm Mike Schill, and soon to be dean of this law school. I was suggesting the collateral effect, or lack of collateral effect that you found is, by that I would mean is debt secured by the property. Is that your hypothesis about why you're not finding the effect? Is it related to, say, cultural reasons with respect to debt and property in these areas? Or is it perhaps the primitive nature of the credit markets, that they just don't exist, or some legal issue with regard to the ability to foreclose on secure property rights? What would be the reason why you don't find that hypothesized effect?
Right. I mean, the reasons will be exactly the three you mentioned. So the question is more, or to make progress, the question will be, do we have any experiment in which two of the three dimensions you mentioned were satisfied and one not, or so? And unfortunately, we know none of the studies got to have the possibility of testing that. So I think it's all speculative. In my paper, basically, what I look into detail is how the credit markets for the poor work. And so it's not only, so basically, I think one of the most binding constraints before getting to the collateral is that most of the people works in the informal labor market. So they were not going to be able to demonstrate earnings, and they're not going to qualify, even if the collateral put their wealth above a threshold at which the existing supply of credit will be interesting to lend. Okay, but then I just touch it in the talk because it will take time. If you're looking at one small intervention like the one I'm looking, you don't expect supply responses. But if you're looking at one like the Peruvian intervention, where more than 1 million households received title over a very short period of time, you might see entry into this sort of entry of suppliers tailoring credit to this specific group, even if they are not formal. It might still be profitable to do that, and there's no effect either there. So, but I cannot say that there is only one constraint, because no study that I know was able to test that.
This collateral effect is quite interesting, because I was at a conference a week before I came here that was organized by the Center for International Private Enterprises, and the first act was to honor Hernando de Soto with some kind of big award, who of course is a primary proponent of the idea that land titling leads to this collateral effect. And yet it seems to be pretty robust in all of the studies that Sebastian summarized, that there was no collateral effect. So somehow it lives on in mythology, even though we haven't been able to find any robust empirical evidence for it. Yes,
yeah, I think this is for Sebastian too. It has to do about the cost effectiveness of titling devices. I guess the gist of the study that you had is that in the urban environment it seems to work better than it does in the rural environment, where you don't know whether it's cost effective. And I'm just curious as to how it is that you define the cost that determines whether or not this thing is going to be effective. Is this a kind of situation where you're going to have to go on the ground, plot by plot, with illiterate people, or somebody take a Google map from above, figure out what the topologies would be, put it into some kind of computer and have it go that particular way? I mean, why are we so confident about that? Is there something about the turnover ratios of land in urban and rural environments that might influence it? I mean, I don't see any reason for a principal distinction there, so I'm just curious what the institutional factors are that might drive it.
So, no, I don't think I was confident that it was not cost effective. I think what I say is that the one study in rural areas that explicitly took the time to do the exercise of just contrasting, let's say, for example, you can do it in several ways, but one way they did it is, well, they estimate how much the land value increased when it's titled contrasted to untitled pieces of land. And so they find some effects. And then the price of land increased by hectare, okay? So assuming, which is a fairly reasonable assumption, that the cost of titling is a fixed cost, well, they find the cutoff point, right? At what point the size of the plot will pay, given the increase in price compared to the cost. And they find that the cutoff point, I think it was 6 hectares, which 6 hectares. And which, for at least for Madagascar and from most of sub-Saharan Africa, is a big piece of plot. And that's what they say. And then in Vietnam, that was not what they find. They find that it was more cost effective. So they only say, well, there's a bunch of studies that they don't do that. So it will be nice in our paper if we can sort of do a similar exercise in a meta-analysis way to have more confidence of whether it is a strong result or is something coming from Madagascar.
Just to make clear from the beginning,
exactly what this summary of the literature shows you is that in rural areas, as I say, land is used as an input to production. So, because in all papers you find effects on investment that is always enhancing productivity, you can say that in rural areas there is an effect of improving the land property rights on earnings. Then there's the question of whether still that pays off or not. But instead, once you move to urban areas, this land is not used as an input of production. So to find an effect, you first has to find an effect on access to credit, or it has to be that households are at such a margin where basically they're using all the labor they have to go to the market and protect the property. So once you reduce the demand from households of protection, they can substitute labor. And then in Peru, they seem to find that, but I don't find that in Argentina. So it's still, I can't say we have a lot of evidence to be conclusive in that margin.
Because it's true that if you read said that there's no communities, but there is an effect on education in urban areas. So, it means that there's a greater probability of finishing secondary school than before. In other words, you have to say that by land and child labor increasing the investment of human capital, you will be really surprised that at least the people who don't expect higher returns of that investment have bigger earnings. So those two results, there is no effect on earnings, and at the same time, there is an effect on bigger investment in human capital. It's really contradictory, at least at the first sight. Maybe it's just the problem with the measurement, maybe the earnings increases will come in the future.
Okay, maybe I should have. Well, I didn't have it, but it's the human capital of the offsprings of the guys who got the title. So yeah, if you look forward into the future, you might expect that they will increase their earnings. Actually, they might increase their earnings quite a bit, because the wage differential from finished high school is of the order of 40%. So, but they are not in the market yet.
Good. So simply, it's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
So if you have a big investment in human capital, you might reasonably expect that you will bring more in the future.
Yeah, that's a reasonable conclusion from my paper, one that I reached in the paper. I don't know. I don't want to oversell my paper in this overview of the literature.
One of the studies of Sebastian's that we supported was to identify all the individuals who were getting, the young people, the children who were getting more education, and also their families, and have a way to come back and do a subsequent study of whether there was an earnings effect in the future. So that would probably answer your question, but it'll take a while to get those results. Yes, please.
This is Lee Benham here. I'm a big fan of this study, and it's been mentioned, but I think it's worth re-emphasizing. In the short run, Sebastian's results showed a substantial fall in adolescent fertility. So that was a relatively short-term effect. And the long-term effect on children's education is gigantic. So while the De Soto effect doesn't seem to be coming through, this is a surprising and very important finding.
Sorry, you can see. This is I'm Bob Cooter from Berkeley. The titling process is a matter of quieting disputes over property. And what that means is that somebody who thinks he has a right to the land gets it, and somebody who thinks he has a right to the land doesn't get it. That's what it means to end a dispute. And I was wondering if you could say something about how that's handled. I'm particularly interested in this because I observed some land titling and survey work in Papua New Guinea, and the disputes among people there were so internecine and complicated and long
can say from my study, I'm not sure I can sort of give you an overview of how it's resolved everywhere in the world. I think Gary might know much more than me about that. In these urban areas, which was the case in Lima and also in the whole Peru and in Buenos Aires, I don't think the issues were or led to that kind of conflict. Basically, squatters tend to squat the area. It might belong to the government or to local governments, and then they don't try to evict the people, and they stay there. So just to give you an example, in the very, very south of Argentina, there is now a province that used to be a federal land, okay? And so they promoted industrialization at some point. So a lot of workers from the poor north migrated there, and they work there. All of them reside in pieces of land that are untitled, but it belongs to the local government, and so far no one feels uncertainty about eviction. Still, it might affect exchange, but it doesn't affect eviction. So in the particular case I studied, basically they squatted the land. The government tried to evict them actually for 6 months. But it's not really. I mean, I can talk about that, but there's nothing to generalize from this episode. So what happened is that there was a military government. They tried to evict them. Then they resisted. Then there was a rape. There was accusations that was one of the police that raped someone living there. So then the government has to retreat. Then they enter into a war with the Falklands, and then the government changed. And then there was elections, and the squatters said, well, we won the land, and the government and the candidates running for president, all of them promises that they were titling the land, but then once in government, they figured out that it didn't belong to the government, so they have to go through a law to expropriate that. And then some owners decided to surrender the land, and some owners decided to go to a court and have a better luck, which they didn't. And what determines the decision of the owner is something we also studied, tracking the cases through the courts of law for many years. And basically, it's not related to land quality or to the offer that the government did. They are equal, and it's an argument that the government lawyers made repeatedly for arguing that it was fair, that it was all based on the previous fiscal valuation of the land that is used for tax purposes. And so it seems that basically the people that did not surrender lands was the groups, the owners that have very large groups of owners. So somehow internal disagreement preclude them from surrendering the land, and that was all that happened.
John, Sebastian, one of the things that bothers me about the land titling literature is that they're not distinguishing between 3 types of disputes about title. So one would be the case in which both parties, or say all the parties involved, it's all private property, but there's real ambiguity about the title. There's a non-formal title system. So there's an issue of to what extent the great title system that is approved. The second one would be a case in which you have squatters squatting on privately owned land and not being evicted. And so there's a reality that de facto they own the land and they can't dispose of it. So it's a matter of creating title to land, to ownership that's de facto versus de jure. And in the third case, which is the one that's most common, that I see in a lot of these cases, is public land that's not owned, and you have squatters. And so in the case of the DeSoto story, titling, when you're looking at effective titling, how much of the effect, whenever it's positive, is the titling effect, or how much is the effect of transferring public land to private hands? And the reason I say that is that in that case, you may be looking at 2 different effects. Because you can imagine a counterfactual. But imagine that the title itself is not very important. The important thing is to transfer framework, which Rossi showed that enclosures raised the value of property of common lands in England in the 18th century. But what Alan pointed out, that's because some of the transfers were redistribution, because they appropriated some of the commons rights of people who are not official owners. And by assigning ownership to a subgroup of people who had access to common land, they were essentially stealing or redistributing rights from one group to another. And therefore, they
of course, I didn't have much time, but when I say it all depends on the status quo, it relates to the points you made, right? It relates to how much.
Get closer to the mic.
It depends on how much the counterfactual of the title. What's exactly the counterfactual of the title? So, of course, one thing is to say, well, I want to answer all these questions. The other is to really have in each study the possibility of separating one effect from the other. There's a second point which I think is more important in the question that you made, which is how much of this is a wealth effect, right? So again, that's going to be case by case. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, most of the people think that the wealth effect will go in the other direction. And in the sense that basically the status quo property rights, in a sense, are redistributing compared to what will be the outcome if you privatize or legalize land. But going concretely in our study, we pay attention to that. We look at the consumption of durable goods, and there was no difference. So, of course, you can always say, well, this guy has such a utility function that they're not going to change the consumption of durables if they have a wealth effect. But under normal behavior, you will expect that if there was a large wealth transfer, you will observe not only that they invest more in the house, but they have more durable goods. And we didn't find that. But you cannot generalize that, right? You can imagine cases where, there is redistribution all the time, any time the governments do things, so it might happen in many cases.
Okay, we're running out of time, and I'm terribly fearful of our Master of Ceremonies who's signaling me. He's probably has somebody back here with a hook. Let me thank you all very much for your attention, and on behalf of the Ronald Coase Institute as well as the organizers, thank you.